Hello and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannan. The causal straw man fallacy. In this video, I'm going to explain a very common logical fallacy that you will find in many atheistic arguments. The informal straw man fallacy is a logic fallacy where one gives the impression of refuting an argument. Meanwhile, the proper idea of the argument under discussion was not addressed or properly refuted. The causal strawman fallacy is where the atheist or non-believer argument is set against a caused God. Meanwhile, the proper idea of God is that God is uncaused. The doctrine of divine simplicity is a central tenet of God's nature and says that God is uncaused and not made of parts. Otherwise, God would be caused by those parts. This doctrine is set forth, for example, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 202. So many non-believers and atheists will ignore the fact that God is uncaused and will make an argument that God does not exist based on the straw man of a caused God. So when arguing with non-believers or atheists, watch out for the causal straw man fallacy. The atheists are knocking down a caused God, not the uncaused God, and giving the false impression that they have disproved the uncaused God. So it's very important to understand this doctrine. As a theist, you should believe it. Unfortunately, many theists are not aware that God is uncaused and that God is divinely simple, meaning he's not made of parts. God is not a composite. God is divinely simple. So this is a critical distinction to understand. Otherwise, you can fall for arguments that contain the causal strawman fallacy. Essentially, the atheist argues against a God that is caused, not a God that is uncaused. And you can knock down a caused God. So they knock down a caused God. The theist doesn't understand that their God is uncaused. And suddenly the theist thinks that this atheistic argument has merit because they're not aware of this fact. So be aware of the causal strawman fallacy. You'll see it a lot in atheistic arguments. And if you're not aware of it, you can easily fall prey to many atheistic arguments. So I'm going to go through a few common atheistic arguments, and I'll show you how they contain the causal strawman fallacy and how to get out of these arguments. But the key to getting out a lot of these arguments is to understand that this exists and to spot it when you see it. So one very common atheistic argument is the turtles all the way down argument. And that goes like this. A Western traveler encounters an Oriental philosopher and asks him to describe the nature of the world. It is a great ball resting on the flat back of the world turtle, says the Oriental philosopher. The traveler says, yes, but What does the world turtle stand on? The Oriental philosopher says, on the back of a still larger turtle. So the traveler says, yes, but what does he stand on? So the Oriental philosopher says, very perceptive question, but it's no use, mister. It's turtles all the way down. So this argument basically is saying it's saying that, well, there's a cause for reality, and you could ask the question, well, what caused that to exist? And the answer is, well, something else. And then you could ask, well, what caused that to exist? And then the answer is, well, something else. Well, where does it end? And the Oriental philosopher says it doesn't end. It's turtles all the way down. It's an infinite regress of causation. So this is a very common atheistic tag. You'll also see it in the argument of, well, who caused God? You'll hear that a lot. And that argument, the turtles all the way down argument, or the who caused God argument, suffers from the causal straw man fallacy. These arguments assume God is caused. Uh, the turtle standing on the next turtle, well, this top turtle has to be caused by this other turtle. And that turtle's standing on another turtle. Well, this turtle has to be caused by that turtle. And you just get this infinite regress of causation because it assumes all the turtles are caused. It assumes all the gods are caused. Who caused God? Assumes God is caused. That's a false assumption. God is uncaused. The doctrine of divine simplicity says that. So this atheistic argument contains the causal straw man fallacy. You simply point out to the atheist, that's not God. God is uncaused. There can't be an infinite regress with God because the buck stops with God. God doesn't have a cause. God simply is the case. Another common atheistic argument is the something from nothing argument. It goes, well, if God is uncaused, then nothing causes God, right? Well, if uh, how can God exist if God is caused by nothing? Or then God is the same thing as nothing, right? So this argument is doing the old switcheroo on you. When you say God is uncaused, you don't mean that nothing causes God. This inserts the fallacy that God is caused, albeit by nothing, but nonetheless, it's creating a caused God. Well, that's again the causal straw man fallacy. Um, God is not caused and is not caused by even nothing. Uh, God is simply the case. God has no cause, no causal explanation. It's not that God is caused by nothing. It's not that God appears from non-existence, such as you would have under creatio ex nihilo. God's existence is not um, due to creatio ex nihilo. That idea is an explanation for why physical reality exists. God creates physical reality through creatio ex nihilo. However, creatio ex nihilo isn't the reason why God himself exists. God is uncaused. Creatio ex nihilo says physical reality appears from non-existence or is caused by. It's not caused. It's caused by God, but appears from non-existence. So you can get confused between this idea and the idea of God being uncaused. So the idea that God is uncaused is not the same as nothing causes God. That would be God actually being caused, albeit by nothing. That's a caused God. Again, the causal straw man fallacy is in this argument, implicitly in this argument. So you got to see that to understand what's wrong with this atheistic argument. Another common atheistic argument you'll hear is, well, you're claiming God is uncaused. That's special pleading. Special pleading is an informal fallacy where you're claiming an exception against all other cases um, because you happen to like your particular exception. So it's favoritism, but it's illogical. However, there is an exception to special pleading, and that is if the exception is justifiable. So in the case of God being uncaused, that's a justifiable exception. So you could have 4,000 different pagan gods, and you could say, yeah, but my God is uncaused. He's different than all the rest of these. So, well, what's the justifiable exception for saying your God, as opposed to 3,999 other gods, deserves this justified exception? How come it's not special pleading? And the reason is because your God is uncaused. The other gods, they're all caused. And that's actually true. If you look through the mythology books, you will find that every other pagan god is a caused god. It has parts, or it is born, or it is self-created. But it's still created. It's a created thing, and if you're created, you can't be uncaused. So you'll find that every other pagan god is in fact caused. The only one that isn't is the Judeo-Christian God, uncaused. God does not have parts. God is not self-created. God is not a composite of any sort. God was not born. The divine nature of God is an uncaused being responsible for the creation of physical reality. And because you need something that's uncaused in order to explain physical reality, God being that cause is a justifiable exception. Otherwise, you have a situation of infinite regress, and infinite regress can be proven to be impossible and illogical. And not only that, we have the Big Bang to prove that physical reality had a beginning, so it can't be an infinite regress. So there's a justifiable exception for God being uncaused, and that's why it can't be special pleading. So this special pleading argument, again, is assuming that God is caused. Why is your caused God different than 3,999 other caused pagan gods? Again, the fallacy, no, God is not caused, God is uncaused. So stop using the causal strawman fallacy in your argument. Special pleading suffers from this fallacy heavily. One last atheistic argument is Eric the God eating magic penguin. Since Eric is God eating by definition, he has no choice but to eat God. So if God exists, he automatically ceases to exist as a result of being eaten. So unless you can prove that Eric doesn't exist, God doesn't exist. Even if you can prove Eric doesn't exist, that same proof will also be applicable to God. There are only two possibilities. Either you can prove Eric doesn't exist, or you can't. In both cases, it logically follows that God doesn't exist. So, what's wrong with this uh, funny atheistic objection? Again, it suffers from the causal straw man fallacy. It's assuming God is caused. So why does it assume that? Well, God is uncaused, and that means that God is not made of parts. Otherwise, he'd be caused by those parts. So, parts are part of a composite of things. That's what a composite is. It's something made of parts. And those parts also have an arrangement, which creates the composite. So when we talk about God being divinely simple or God not being composed of parts, what we're saying is God is not a composite. So when you talk about eating God, you're talking about destroying God. But destruction is the disassociation of parts. God doesn't have parts, which means you can't disassociate God's parts because God doesn't have any parts, which means you can't destroy God. God is indestructible. Not even God can destroy God. You cannot destroy an uncaused thing. Uh, so God can't be eaten. There's no way, because eating God means destroying God. God doesn't have parts. God can't be destroyed. Eric can't eat God. And another point is that Eric, the magic God-eating penguin, in order to eat, would have to have parts. He would have to have a mouth, or at least he would have to change in some fashion in order to eat. And anything that changes has parts. It's a composite. So Eric would have to be a composite. God is uncaused. God is unchanging. That's basic doctrine regarding God's nature. God is unchanging because God is not a composite. God doesn't have parts. God is divinely simple. There's nothing to change in God. Can't change God. But Eric can change because Eric can eat. Eric has parts. Eric has a mouth. So Eric is caused, whereas God is uncaused. You can't destroy an uncaused God. You certainly can't eat an uncaused God. There's nothing to eat. There's no composite to eat. And you can't destroy God, so you can't digest him anyway. So the this idea of Eric contains the causal strawman fallacy. Again, it's assuming God is caused. God is made of parts. God is capable of being eaten. And that's all false. God is uncaused. God is not made of parts. God is indestructible. God is not capable of being eaten. In fact, Eric is a composite, is not a supreme God, isn't even close to being God, because he's made of parts. He's a composite. He's a caused thing. So God and Eric are clearly not the same thing, and God is far supreme to Eric, a caused penguin. Okay, so the lesson is, as a theist, if you're arguing with atheists or non-believers, watch out for the causal strawman fallacy. You'll see it a lot in a great number of atheistic arguments. You got to spot it and understand. Another thing is understand that God is uncaused and how the doctrine of the divine simplicity is fundamental and extraordinarily important in terms of defeating atheistic arguments. All right. Hope you learned something. Take care.